We've uncovered now that intention perception gap. We know that self-awareness can be our secret kind of weapon to start to bridge it. But how do we put this all into practice when we're sitting face to face or screen to screen with someone? And what I want to do is start and really go back to chapter 1, the neuroscience of avoidance. But this time I want to explore the science of what actually enables people to be able to override that avoidance response and have the conversation anyway. So I'm going to go through a few tools, techniques that are all grounded very much in kind of the neuroscience to help us override that strong neurological kind of pull that we have towards avoidance. So the most powerful neurological lever is cognitive reappraisal, the ability to consciously reframe how the brain has labelled an experience. So research shows that when we deliberately reframe a threatening situation, activity in the amygdala decreases, while activity in the prefrontal cortex increases. So you're essentially using your thinking brain to regulate your emotional brain. So for difficult conversations, this sounds like shifting from thinking that the conversation could go badly to this is a conversation of an act of care. Or another example might be they might react badly to not having this conversation is the real risk. Or we might be saying to ourselves, I might get it wrong. But let's reframe that. A good enough conversation is better than no conversation. Now, the reframe has got to be genuinely believable to the brain. Just some hollow, positive kind of spin that you put on it won't shift the amygdala. But a meaningful reframe, such as the ones that I've just given you as an example there, can genuinely alter that neurological threat assessment and move it away from the threat. The second strategy, reducing uncertainty. Since uncertainty is one of the kind of primary drivers of avoidance, anything that increases predictability reduces the threat signal and it makes the approach system much more accessible. So this is why preparation really does matter neurologically, not just from a practical point of view. So when you actually think through likely responses, take the time, think through the likely responses reaction in advance. If you clarify the key messages of your conversation in advance, if you perhaps prepare a clear opening line, then you're literally reducing the amygdala activation because you're giving the brain more certainty about what's ahead, what's likely to come. So the conversation will naturally feel less dangerous because it feels less unknown. Psychological safety. Research consistently shows that psychological safety doesn't just help the recipient of a difficult conversation, but it also helps the person initiating that conversation. When we feel safe in our environment, when we feel supported by our leaders, then we're not threatened by the consequences of imperfection. So we have a much lower baseline threat level. So that means when we do have that additional threat load of having to have or start a difficult conversation, it's less likely to tip and turn into a full amygdala hijack, a really, really strong threat response. And this is one of the most compelling, but often least expressed arguments for building psychological safety at both team and organisational level. Because it's not just about people speaking up, it's about leaders being able to have the conversation that performance requires. The if-then mechanism, one of the most robust findings in behaviour change research, is the power of if-then planning. When people pre-decide their behaviour in a specific situation, they dramatically increase the likelihood of following through, even under threat conditions. So, for example, in a difficult conversation, this could look like, if I notice I'm avoiding this conversation for a third day, then I'll send a meeting invite immediately. If they become defensive, then I'll pause, take a breath, and ask a curious question. Now, the reason this works neurologically is that it transfers the decision from a system 1 to a system 2 in advance. So in the moment, the brain doesn't have to choose between approach or avoidance because the choice has already been made. It comes back to that planning, creating certainty. Labelling the emotion, research again carried out by Matthew Lieberman at UCLA, showed that affect labelling, in other words, naming an emotion, reduces the amygdala activation and increases prefrontal cortex, where we do all that great thinking, actually increases the engagement of the prefrontal cortex. So simply saying, even to yourself, I'm feeling anxious about this conversation, shifts processing from the reactive limbic system towards the regulatory prefrontal cortex. You're starting to move in the right direction to take back some of that control. So for managers, this is actually a micro skill with a macro impact, because teaching managers to notice and name their avoidance before it actually becomes a pattern, a habit, is one of the most practical neurological interventions that we have. The role of values and identity. Research on the self-determination theory and identity-based motivation shows that when behaviour is connected to who we believe ourselves to be, the approach system becomes significantly stronger. So what I mean by that is a manager who thinks I am someone who has honest conversations will be able to override the avoidance approach more readily than the person who thinks, I should probably have this conversation. It's about shifting the outcome focus from, I need to resolve this issue, to, I'm the kind of leader who addresses things directly and with understanding. So it's about making that connection of who we think we are, who we believe ourselves to be, and that will then help us to shift towards the approach system. Perhaps the most practical of all is regulating our nervous system first. We cannot access our cognitive resources that are needed to have a good, difficult conversation if your nervous system is already dysregulated. And when we regulate our nervous system, there's actually a sequence, and the sequence really does matter. We first of all start with we regulate. And to do that, we use techniques such as breathing techniques, the 3-3-3 reset technique, for example, breathe in for 3, hold for 3, out for 3, or perhaps physical kind of movement can also help to regulate. The second step is reappraise. That's where we start to reframe the stakes and the intent. Third, prepare. So that's all of that we talked about a minute ago, reducing the uncertainty by having a clear opening, thinking the situation through. And then finally, initiate. Actually go ahead and have that conversation. But if we do regulate, reappraise, prepare, we're actually going to have that conversation from a starting point of relatively calm and having some clarity around the purpose and what we want to achieve. And trying to skip steps 1 to 3 and go straight to the conversation is neurologically setting yourself up to either avoid or to have a conversation from a threat state, which rarely ends well. So what is really striking about all of these mechanisms is that none of them are about willpower or courage in the traditional sense. They're about creating the right neurological conditions under which the approach system can actually override the natural avoidance system. And just this single reframe I'm about to kind of give you alone is potentially transformative. And simply going from I or you need to be braver to let's create the conditions my or your brain needs. So rather than saying, oh, I need to be brave about this, just reframing that to I'm going to create the condition my brain needs to have this conversation well.